If you're a woman living in the United States, chances are you've heard something along the lines of this. My ex-girlfriend was the worst!
Nobody talks like that. Also, why are you limiting this to the United States? I promise you that every single country is full of men who think their exes were the worst, and women who think their exes were the worst. Some may express it a little differently, sure, but being upset with someone you dated and broke up with is one of the most normal human things there is in terms of dating. Seriously, where could you possibly take this? How is your video 7 minutes long?
She was always asking me to be, present for her emotionally. What does that even mean?
In my experience, it means shut up and listen and realize that her emotions take precedence over everything else in the universe. Also, this is pretty specific. It's almost as if you're complaining about an ex without complaining about an ex. Clever girl, I like you.
Women are crazy sometimes.
Oh no, he didn't use crazy in a less than literal way to describe a woman he was upset with. Now I don't understand how you didn't do this for an hour or more. Seriously, it must have taken some legit restraint. And I know, bitches be crazy.
Unfortunately, the intersection of mental health stigma and sexism is all too common in our culture. Women are often depicted as crazy, emotionally unstable, overly sensitive, or hysterical. This is what I like to refer to as the hysterical woman stereotype.
Okay. While this can be overdone and depicted in blatant sexist ways, this is a stereotype with merit. Not so much that all women are hysterical, but that women absolutely feel and respond to emotion differently from men. But you're never going to agree with that until you give up and admit that there are psychological differences between the sexes. In fact, it'd be a Darwinian miracle if this weren't true. The irony of this criticism coming from modern feminism is kind of cringeworthy as well. Do you honestly think intersectional feminism has done a good job of dispelling this misconception? Really?
Why the fuck did you accept the position?
Because
Who the fuck hired you? I'm sorry that you have no consideration for actual Hawaiian people who don't want to be a bobblehead item in your car while you're driving for lifts. You fucking selfish, dumbass idiot.
I'm being rude.
How dare you! How dare you! Disgusting! Disgusting!
You left room saying your daughter's lives matter, but
Disgusting! You just abused a woman!
It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here.
We're
Said
being
that he works
disorderly.
for a security company,
We're
not
disrupting
the
the
city.
meeting.
So I don't have to do what he wants. So fuck off.
Then listen the fuck up and understand what we're actually about.
Now, to be fair, I think you're a fine young lady, and I can't actually see you behaving this way. But suffice it to say that you've got a lot of very loud and very obviously unstable, counterproductive people in your camp. How possible is it that women like this are actually perpetuating these hysterical woman stereotypes by acting fucking hysterical all the fucking time? These come out like daily at this point.
Not only is the stereotype used to disregard women's thoughts, feelings, and opinions, but it also paints mental illness in an extremely negative light. On one hand, the hysterical woman stereotype demonizes women who express their emotions.
Do you actually see widespread demonizing of women expressing their emotions, or do you more often see demonizing of women who express their emotions hysterically? There's a difference between expressing emotion and having absolutely no control over them. And if we go back to the guy's statement that women are crazy sometimes, that's expressing an emotion. It's expressing exasperation towards a woman that he thought was too needy for him. And how is it any different from a frustrated ex-girlfriend saying men are pigs, or in fact, men are crazy? It isn't different. It's normal. Why does every little thing upset you people? You're probably getting upset right now just from me saying you people. This is why you can't exist outside your bubble. You're impossible to be around. Can you tell that I dated a feminist before? Because, yeah, fuck you. I'm venting.
On the other hand, it portrays mental illness as a defect that can be used to write off mentally ill people altogether.
On the third hand, mental illnesses are defects by fucking definition. We shouldn't dismiss them, and we don't. But yeah, sometimes we say crazy when we don't mean legitimately mentally ill. Get over it. Jesus, we beat down the Christians, and now feminists are the new moralists, policing every word or action that doesn't fit their worldview. It's fucking annoying.
The stereotype functions to categorize women and mentally ill people as abnormal, weak, incompetent, and inferior to social majority groups such as men and non-mentally ill people.
Throughout this entire video, you're going to be making the blanket statement mental illness as if it's all one thing. But depending on which mental illness we're talking about, the only thing here I consider to be a complete misrepresentation is the term inferior. I don't think any mentally ill people are inferior. That's a judgment you can't make. But mental illness is an abnormality. It can make you weak, it can affect your competence, and that's why we treat them, because they aren't normal, they aren't healthy. That's what illness means.
Some of you might be wondering where this stereotype came about in the first place.
It came from dealing with hysterical women. She's going to say something completely different, but the actual stereotype came from men having to deal with hysterical women, and probably menstruation.
Well, the construction of mental illness and the construction of femininity are actually pretty similar. Historically, mental illness has been constructed as a mental defect or the lack of ability to function in mainstream society. If non-mentally ill people set the standard for how normal people should function in everyday life, then mentally ill people, by definition, are considered dysfunctional and not the norm. Social views about mental illness, like disability, are rarely articulated explicitly, but still remain deeply ingrained in our cultural consciousness.
See? It's bullshit. It came from a relatively primitive reaction to women behaving in ways that men just didn't understand at the time. Probably while menstruating. Really, I think it all comes down to periods, really.
Mentally ill people are stereotyped as emotionally unstable, untrustworthy, incompetent, lazy, weak, dependent, and even dangerous.
Right, all of those things at once, right? Again, depending on what actual mental illness you're talking about, they may be emotionally unstable, untrustworthy, lazy, weak, dependent, and even dangerous. These are all actual symptoms of various mental illness. Fuck.
Not only does the stigmatization of mental illness create prejudice against mentally ill people, but it also makes it more likely that mentally ill people will be discriminated against in larger social institutions, like schools, housing, and the workforce.
Our society considers mental illness to be a legal defense. I don't think it's fair to say that as a whole it stigmatizes mental illness, but it is true. If you do stigmatize mental illness, you're more likely to unfairly discriminate against it. But this is illegal. Mentally ill people are a protected class in this country.
It's also extremely ironic that we label the mentally ill as violent and dangerous because, on top of discrimination, mental health stigma puts mentally ill people at a higher risk of being abused or sexually assaulted.
Listen, I agree with you here. The more common mental illnesses like depression make people more vulnerable to violence, but the emotional instability you scoffed at earlier and illnesses like depression are often the reason for this. They get in with the wrong kind of person, are easily manipulated, and more likely to stay in toxic environments. Now, I don't see these people being demonized exactly, but I do see them being pitied. I'm inclined to believe violent crime is lower, as you said, but your source is a part of a larger article, which gives you that number when substance abuse is eliminated, which cuts it down by a third. I believe addiction really does need to be considered a legitimate mental illness, and I think also there are many violent criminals who have gone undiagnosed. That number is probably a lot higher than it should be. Never mind the people who aren't reported at all, who commit these violent crimes. I know of people who have been violent because of a mental illness who were never reported because it was family members or something like that. The number's definitely higher. And listen, there's hundreds of mental illnesses that affect people in various different ways, and a fraction of those make them violent. So naturally, violent crime based on mental disorder will be lower when such mental disorders are extremely rare. It's absolutely wrong to assume that any mental illness makes a person more violent, but it's understandable why people who couldn't fathom committing a violent crime use mental illness as an explanation for it to disassociate themselves from the possibility of committing such an awful crime. But I think more than often, this is used not to demonize, but to soften the demonization and deny that some people are just awful people. Godwin's law warning here, but the notion that Hitler was insane actually bothered me when I was taking an elective literature class that focused entirely on the Holocaust. It was a cool class. Many of the student papers that I'd peer review would throw in this accusation of insanity for Hitler amongst various visceral reactions to the atrocity of the Holocaust. Understandable, but unnerving to me. This led me to write a long-lost paper about the terrifying reality that we have no reason to believe mental illness inspired Hitler's actions at all, and that he most likely justified genocide from a purely bigoted ideological standpoint. That is an extremely uncomfortable truth for a relatively civilized mind to accept, that the circumstances that inform your worldview may be one of the only things that prevents you from being a monster, and that no rare mental illness is needed for you to commit horrendous acts against another human being.
In her incredibly important piece on disability theory, Emory University professor Rosemary Garland Thompson coined the idea of the ability-disability system. According to Garland Thompson, the ability-disability system is a pervasive cultural system that stigmatizes certain kinds of bodily variations. This system can also be applied to mental illness and other mental variations like autism, or what some people describe as neurodiversity. Neurodivergent, a term coined in the late 90s, is used to describe people whose minds function differently than what societal standards consider normal. Activists who use the neurodiversity paradigm argue that neurodiversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity, and the inequality that neurodiverse people experience is a result of social power dynamics and not an innate biological inadequacy.
Yeah, it's bullshit. Social dynamics play into every aspect of human interaction to some extent, and you may have noticed that your attempts to control them haven't gone over really well with the general public. But it is clearly agenda-driven to suggest that all it is social. Neurodiversity rejects the idea of a normal or healthy brain, which is a denial of mental illness altogether, so it's funny you're using the term so much. And the explicit distinction between the paradigm and the movement is kind of pointless considering it has very little to do with science and almost everything to do with philosophy. So this is a very clear attempt to equate mental disability with different personality traits. It is one thing to suggest the mentally ill not be demonized or stigmatized, and that their rights not be infringed on. We agree with each other here. It is another thing entirely to suggest that their illness should be embraced by society or even themselves if they are not functional. Have you ever had someone who is paralyzed from the waist down point to their legs and say, "This is normal"? It's not. Your legs are designed for a purpose, and if they are incapable of fulfilling that purpose, then they don't work. They are defective, and it sucks. Neurodiversity stemmed from the autistic rights movement and still focuses disproportionately on the autistic people. Many of them happen to be highly functioning and go so far as to say that they wouldn't want an autism cure if we were to find one. This is all well and good for those people, but attempting to stop medical research for a cure so that others who long for one are denied is a bridge too far, and that's what they're doing. So this causes much contention within the autistic circles. You can imagine how many people with far less functional disabilities would react. Trying to normalize borderline personality disorder, depression, bipolar 1 and 2, schizophrenia, paranoid or psychotic disorders, panic disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, addiction, anorexia, the list goes on. It's no wonder I can't find very many neurodiversity arguments that stray from the relative comfort of highly functioning autistic people when it is extremely clear in most mental disorders that social factors are nowhere near the primary issue. Seriously, social justice philosophy is not an adequate replacement for fucking neuroscience.
According to Rosemary Garland Thompson, feminist disability theory illustrates that disability and womanhood are not natural states of inferiority, but culturally fabricated myths, similar to the social construction of race.
Now, I'll tell you right there, that is a whole lot of bad religion. So what she believes is that mental illness and womanhood, are not inferior states. I agree with this. Then she makes the huge fucking leap and says they are myths. No, they aren't. You're a woman. Womanhood is everything that makes you not a man, and my manhood is everything that makes me not a woman. Mental illness is a thing, and biological race absolutely does exist. If you just stopped at other races, genders, and people with disabilities are not inferior states, we'd agree. But because your entire ideology is based on wishful fucking thinking, you just have to take it that one step further and chase that comfortable lie.
Women have historically been stereotyped as dependent, frail, incompetent, unintelligent, and submissive. Like mental illness, the state of womanhood has similarly been conflated with being flawed or inadequate. According to Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, men are constructed as the default gender, whereas women are constructed in relation to them and almost always as inferior. De Beauvoir argues that masculinity represents both the positive and the neutral, whereas femininity represents only the negative.
She was also born in 1908, and The Second Sex was written in 1949. One of the biggest flaws of your movement currently is that it's not new enough. The intersectional approach to feminism existed probably before your parents were even born, and the people who fed you your ideas have been struggling to gain legitimate ground for decades, while equity feminists were out doing real, actual work, making necessary advancements for gender equality. You, a young woman who has never faced oppression in your entire life, have not only adopted an outdated feminist philosophy, but also a view of America that is half a century old.
Damn. Additionally, feminine perceived behavior is also stigmatized. For instance, women are frequently stereotyped as being too emotional or hypersensitive. According to a 2014 study, women are more likely than men to be characterized as expressing negative or inappropriate emotions in response to external stressors. I don't know about you, but I've seen some of my brother's reactions to external stressors, and I would argue that punching a hole in your door is less than appropriate.
Well, yeah, we know men are more prone to aggression, especially teenage boys, right? But fuck it, womanhood doesn't exist. Only toxic masculinity exists. But it'd probably be healthier for you to punch a hole in a door than to succumb to a cultish ideology that blames literally everything entirely on society. I'm just saying. And I'm sorry to break it to you, but the hypersensitive stereotype is one you actually fit pretty well. This entire video started with something as trivial as an upset ex-boyfriend calling his ex-girlfriend crazy, for fuck's sake, and it went off into a tirade about mental illness. Seriously, that's hypersensitivity. Most stereotypes are based on some kind of fact. Levels of testosterone and estrogen very much seem to play into these stereotypes. A study showed that women's brains are more responsive to negative emotional stimuli, but high testosterone women were less reactive. They think this could help explain why women are more susceptible to the mental illnesses akin to depression and anxiety than men, and why men are more susceptible to sociopathy. 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 Fuck me. Anyway, obviously social conditioning does matter, but it's an absolute truth that our biology plays a major role in who we are, and it actually is crazy to dismiss scientific evidence the way that you do.
So next time you think about calling your ex-girlfriend crazy for expressing her emotions, you should probably reconsider. Because calling one woman crazy really only ends up hurting all women and all mentally ill people, and makes it easier to justify discriminating against them.
Better idea. Deal with your frustrations the way you see fit. As long as you aren't hurting anybody, you're fine. Don't worry about the nagging voice of crazy women who have been called crazy so many times they are actively using a movement to convince people that calling them crazy is calling all women crazy. You're smarter than that. Most people are. Goodbye.